Welcome back. It's time to talk about learning. So let's get started. Uh, so for a lot of people, the term learning is meant to describe learning new information in class or something like that. That's actually going to be the chapter on memory in this class. Learning for psychologists is different from learning to other people. So here we have a cartoon that depicts three of the main learning theories. We've got Skinner, to enter, press lever, because he taught rats to press levers. Pavlov, knock, do not ring bell, dogs inside, because he taught dogs to drool to the sound of a bell. And then Bandura, please watch videotape on how to knock, because Bandura talked about learning through observation, and he used videotapes to serve as the thing that was observed. These are the kinds of things that we're talking about when we refer to learning. And these oftentimes are pretty simple behaviors. So let's get into the types of learning and then a little bit about why we don't mean memory when we mean learning. All right, so we've got three main kinds of learning that we're going to talk about. We have classical conditioning, which is where a meaningless stimulus out in the world predicts the arrival of a meaningful stimulus. And as a result, the meaningless stimulus becomes meaningful. Okay, so we'll talk about that. Operant conditioning is where we change our behavior in response to the consequences that we've gotten in the past for the same or similar behaviors. And then social learning is where we learn through observation and imitation. All of them, I thought I had one more ball coming down, but apparently I was wrong. All of them rely on associations being formed. And that's the key to learning, is when the learner forms an association between, in classical conditioning, two stimuli out in the world, in operant conditioning, between their behavior and their consequences, and in social learning theory, between a person or an object and that we want to be like, and then our own behaviors. So let's start with classical conditioning. Okay, when Pavlov's dog begs, puts up a sign that says, "We'll drool for bells." He's most famous for conditioning dogs to drool to the sound of a bell, so that's why the jokes all pertain to bells ringing and dogs drooling. Here's a picture of Ivan Pavlov. He was Russian, and he accidentally discovered classical conditioning during his research on the function of saliva. He was a physiologist, and he was trying to figure out why we drool when we eat. And so, there were various hypotheses, such as to lubricate the food so it'll slide down our throats, or to start breaking down the food ahead of arrival in the stomach. There were different reasons that were offered for why we salivate. So he was testing the hypothesis that it's needed for lubricating the throat. So he had dogs that he sliced open their cheeks and pulled their salivary glands out to the outside so that he could put a little pipette onto the salivary gland and collect their saliva. This was 1904, something like that. And these poor dogs did not have a good time in their crates. They were basically chained to the wall so that they wouldn't harm their salivary glands that were out and exposed. And so they didn't have a lot going on all day, right? They just were stuck in their crate. And then the most exciting thing that would happen to them is they would get fed. And so he would collect the saliva that they would secrete when they were eating, right? There's a picture of my dog. You'll notice he not only isn't tied to the wall, he doesn't even have to wear a collar. He's so spoiled. So that's my dog Copper. And I can guarantee you my dog Copper can put out some slobber. So luckily we're not going to use his actual slobber as the demonstration. I drew some in. So here's my dog Copper on an everyday day. Let's pretend I'm going to try and classically condition him. So before any conditioning happens, I have to present to him the meaningless stimulus. In this case, it's a little bell ringing. Copper's not impressed by the bell ringing. It means nothing to him, so it's considered a neutral stimulus. It carries no inherent value to the learner. So before conditioning, the neutral stimulus should not elicit any kind of response. Okay, so bell rings. Before any kind of conditioning occurs, in the case of dog food, that food will elicit that response without any kind of training necessary. So in Pavlov's research, he was trying to collect the saliva that he expected to be secreted when the dogs ate. So every day, the animal handler would go into the locked area of the kennels, and to gain access, the person who monitored the door would have to push a button, and it would make a buzzing sound. As long as that sound was going, that meant the door was unlocked, and the animal caretaker could go in and distribute the food dishes. So on day one, before the dogs had learned anything, they heard the buzzer of the door, they got their food. Eating the food naturally made them drool. So the food was serving as the unconditioned stimulus. The drooling was their unconditioned response to that unconditioned stimulus. That's the natural thing that happens when you eat dog food. Apparently, it makes you drool. The buzzer of the door was serving as the neutral stimulus, that accidental, pairing that's going to occur. That was the buzzer of the door. So we've got an unconditioned stimulus, food, and an unconditioned response, drooling to food. All right. Now, during conditioning, and this is what Pavlov did by accident, you're going to pair the neutral stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus. So you ring the bell, and then you present the food. The dog starts to eat the food, and then the dog produces the unconditioned response of drooling to the food. Now, if you do this a few times in a row, my computer is letting me know that you guys probably can't hear that bell ringing, but at least you can see it shaking, and I'm sure you've heard a bell ring before in your life. If you pair that often enough, pretty soon the dog comes to the conclusion that the food is going to, I didn't let it manifest itself correctly, there we go. Pretty soon the dog starts to realize the bell rings, and shortly thereafter, my food arrives. Now, my dog, like I said, he's so spoiled, he doesn't even have to wear a collar. In fact, he's a pretty lucky dog. He has chickens to stare at. He has a little property to run around on. He's got a very rich and full life for a dog, right? For Pavlov's dogs, if you recall, they were chained to the wall and had nothing to do and all day to do it. The big highlight of their lives was getting fed. My dog literally gets so excited about dinner time that he starts dancing around and doing his little thing because, oh my gosh, dinner's coming. And in fact, he probably gets to eat during the day sometimes. We flip him some snacks and stuff in the middle of the day. So, for my dog to get that excited about eating when he has other things that could occupy his mind and he's probably not that hungry, imagine how excited Pavlov's dogs got about dinner time. Right? They've been sitting in their crates, not really able to do anything all day, and then food arrives. It's got to be a big, exciting thing for them. So they're looking for anything out in the environment that will help them to predict that the big, exciting thing, getting fed, is about to happen. Right? So they probably conditioned even faster than my dog Copper would do. Know what I mean by conditioned? Well, after conditioning, you can present what had been the neutral stimulus, but now you'll notice I've relabeled it. Now it's called the conditioned stimulus because now the learner has made an association between this stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus, the stimulus that they naturally would respond to. And they start to see, this bell keeps consistently ringing before my beloved food arrives. I hear the bell ring. I know my food's coming, and I get all excited, and I start drooling in anticipation. And that's what the dogs in Pavlov's studies did. They heard the buzzer of the door, and they started drooling. And he knew they were drooling because he was collecting their saliva from those pipettes. So initially, he was kind of perplexed why they were drooling ahead of time. After exploring classical conditioning a little bit, he started to realize that they had made an association between the neutral stimulus, the buzzer, and the meaningful stimulus, the unconditioned stimulus, which was the food, and they started to produce what he called a conditioned response. I deliberately drew the same drool on copper every time, so you would see that the response itself doesn't actually change when it's an unconditioned response or a conditioned response. What changes is what causes it. So if we go back to our conditioning, the unconditioned response is drooling to the food, right? I have food in my mouth and now I'm drooling. When we get to after conditioning, now I'm drooling because I heard the bell ring. That bell that normally had been preceding my food, I hear it ring and I think, oh, here comes my food. All the saliva starts coming out because I'm so excited because I want to get fed. So the conditioned response is not different in substance to the unconditioned response. It's different in what elicits it. Now, it's a good time to point out that the word conditioning is another word for learning or training. So after training, we see that this trained response is occurring to the trained stimulus, right? So if you think about it, the food and the drooling, that's unlearned. That happens naturally. It's the associating the bell with the food so that what had been a neutral stimulus, the bell, has become now a conditioned stimulus, and it elicits that conditioned response. So let's apply this to some real-life kinds of examples. Your romantic partner always uses the same shampoo. Soon, the smell of that shampoo makes you feel happy. All right, so we've got an unconditioned stimulus, an unconditioned response, a neutral stimulus, a conditioned stimulus, and a conditioned response, all included in this little example. So since I can't make you raise your hands and participate, I'll just walk you through it. So unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response. We have the unconditioned stimulus that naturally elicits some reaction, the unconditioned response. So in this case, we have that phrase at the end, makes you feel happy. So that's going to be the response, right? What naturally in this setup would make you feel happy? Well, hopefully your romantic partner makes you feel happy. And that's natural because this is your romantic partner. This is how you feel about them. So the unconditioned stimulus is the romantic partner. The unconditioned response is feeling happy when you're with your romantic partner. The neutral stimulus is the smell of the shampoo. You've smelled those shampoos before. You've smelled it on other people, but now that it's started to be paired with your romantic partner, it starts to take on meaning. So now when you smell a smell that previously had meant nothing, now when you smell it, it means something. It makes you feel the same way as the original unconditioned stimulus did. So now, after pairing with your romantic partner often enough, that neutral stimulus becomes a conditioned stimulus. So now the smell of that shampoo elicits in you feelings that previously only your romantic partner had elicited, that feeling happy. So the pairing of the smell of the shampoo with your romantic partner made the shampoo into a conditioned stimulus that can elicit that conditioned response. The door to your house squeaks loudly when you open it. Soon, your dog begins wagging its tail when the door squeaks. Now, it's always good to reflect on what makes the door squeak. You coming in it, right? And what makes your dog wag its tail? You coming in. So you come home and the dog starts wagging its tail and getting all excited. Okay, so you come home, dog wags its tail. Before you come through the door, though, the thing that announces your arrival is that squeak. So it goes, there's you, and the dog goes, yay! There's you, yay! So pretty soon that squeak gets paired with your arrival often enough. So your arrival is the unconditioned stimulus that elicits that unconditioned response. You coming home makes your dog happy, right? You're the unconditioned stimulus. Wagging his tail is the unconditioned response. By pairing that squeak, which could be a neutral stimulus, but by pairing it with your arrival, that squeak takes on meaning. So it becomes the conditioned stimulus that makes your dog start wagging its tail with its conditioned response. Even if it turns out that it's not you, or, it's not what the dog was hoping for, that squeak is enough to get the dog to start wagging in anticipation. The nurse says, "This won't hurt a bit," and stabs you with a needle. The next time you hear, "This won't hurt," you cringe in fear. Again, there's a little inference that you have to make in this one, because stabbing you with a needle makes you cringe, right? Pain makes you cringe. So the unconditioned stimulus is pain, that in this case you're getting from the needle, and the unconditioned response is cringing or shrinking away. So the nurse precedes the stabbing with the comforting phrase, "This won't hurt a bit," right? It should be neutral to maybe even positive, because she's reassuring you it's not going to hurt. So the nurse says, "This won't hurt a bit," then elicits the pain. And you cringe away in fear because you experience pain. So the neutral stimulus, the reassurance, is paired with the unconditioned stimulus of pain, and that elicits the unconditioned response of fear. So the next time you go to take a shot or some other thing where somebody says, "Oh, this won't hurt," it now is carrying meaning that phrase is carrying meaning that it didn't have before. And so now it's a conditioned stimulus where you've learned something about that. And so now when you hear it, you know it's the opposite of what that phrase says. So if it says, "This won't hurt," cringe in fear. So that's your conditioned response to that formerly neutral statement, which now is your conditioned stimulus. You have a meal at a fast food restaurant that causes food poisoning. The next time you see a sign for that restaurant, you feel nauseated. Okay, so previously when you saw the sign, you pulled in and you got food, and then you got food poisoning. So the thing that actually elicited the nausea or the vomiting or whatever we mean by nauseated, or whatever we mean by food poisoning, that was the food that caused that. There was something in the food and you got sick. But right before you ate the food, you said, there's the sign for this fast food restaurant that I normally like. Let's go in. So right before you consumed the thing that actually made you sick, you saw the sign for the restaurant. So the sign had been neutral, right? Neutral to positive. You liked it enough that you pulled in. The food is the unconditioned stimulus that caused the unconditioned response of food poisoning and presumably, vomiting or whatever. The next time you see the sign for that restaurant, it has now become a conditioned stimulus. And you're like, just thinking about it makes me queasy, right? So you display the conditioned response. I don't want to eat there anymore. So one trial learning is enough for that. We'll talk about that in a second. So let's talk about the acquisition phase of a classical conditioned response. So as I demonstrated with my pictures of copper, you have a pairing during the acquisition phase of the neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus. So the NS is the neutral stimulus, the US is the unconditioned stimulus. Okay, over time, as we pair those two things, the strength of the conditioned response gets higher and higher, so that the drooling in anticipation, once you hear the bell. So the bell starts to elicit the drooling before you actually get food in your mouth, more and more as time goes on, as that pair occurs. During this phase, it's really super important that the neutral stimulus comes before the unconditioned stimulus. I don't know if that just makes no sense to you, but they actually had to study this for a number of years to figure out, when does the association form? So you have to ring the bell and then present the food. If you present the food and the dog's already eating the food and then ring the bell is not very informative. So it's not predicting anything. It's unlikely to form an unconditioned. It's very unlikely to form a conditioned association. So you have to have that neutral stimulus precede the meaningful or unconditioned stimulus. So you'll notice in the examples that I gave, you ring the bell, then present the unconditioned stimulus, and that produces the unconditioned response. And then the learner figures out the relationship. Now, what happens with classically conditioned association if you stop following up with the unconditioned stimulus? So during acquisition, we go neutral stimulus, unconditioned, neutral stimulus, unconditioned. And we get to the point where the learner is responding to the neutral stimulus, now conditioned stimulus, so well that it's become almost as pronounced as it used to be just to the unconditioned stimulus. So you ring the bell and the dog drools just as much as the dog used to drool to the food. And you're like, wow, this dog is really conditioned, right? We can make it go away by presenting the conditioned stimulus alone. So ring the bell and don't follow it up with food. Keep doing that, and ultimately the dog will learn that it no longer predicts the arrival of food. So that's another piece of evidence that the learner is making associations between this, what had been neutral stimulus, and what has always been a meaningful stimulus, and looking for things out in the environment that will help them to predict when the meaningful stimulus is going to arrive. Now, it looks like in this picture that if we do this conditioned stimulus by alone, that we can just get rid of the drooling to the bell response altogether, or the conditioned response altogether. It's not quite that simple, because they found that if you just let some time pass, no training or anything happens during the pause after extinction has occurred, you'll get a little bit of what's called a spontaneous recovery, where you've rung the bell by itself to the point where now the dog is no longer drooling at all to the bell. Just let a little bit of time elapse. It could be minutes, it could be a couple of days. Ring the bell and you get a reactivation of the response. Now, it's not back where it was at the peak of training, but it's a little bit of a response, as if the learner is saying, maybe it's informative again. Get all excited. Ooh, is there food coming? Oh, it's by itself. And you go ahead and complete the extinction phase so the dog's not drooling at all. Let some time elapse, come back, and you'll get a smaller spontaneous recovery the next time. And you keep doing that until you fully eliminate the behavior. When my dogs were puppies, when they were all learning what sit, stay, come, all those things mean, we used a clicker as a reinforcer. And so clickers are an example of, classical conditioning with positive reinforcement, which is an operant conditioning term. But with the animal or child, you can use clickers on children too. What they learn is that clicker predicts that a treat's coming. And so that's where the classical conditioning part is. So if you've ever seen any of those clickers at like PetSmart or whatever, you click the clicker and then give a food reward, and the animal starts to learn that the clicker predicts the treat, and they start responding to the clicker as almost as well as they had been to a food treat. So pretty soon you can get rid of the food treats and just reward with clickers. And then once they get to that point, I usually try and pair the click with, good boy, good girl, pet the head, whatever, reinforce with affection. And then pretty soon I can just skip the clicker altogether. Well, whenever we get a new puppy in the house, we pull out the clicker again and we train the puppy what its name is and stuff like that using the clicker. And you should see those older dogs come running out. They haven't heard a clicker in 10 years, and they're like, whoa, I hear a clicker. I will sit, I'll lay down, I'll do all my things, hoping I'm going to get some kind of food reward, because I remember that clicker represents food. It's amazing how they come trotting out. I'll put them over there. Okay, you lay down over here. I'm going to work with the puppy. And here comes adult dog going, me too, I want something, because I remember that clicker is associated with food. So I think the pause can be really long, and you can get a reactivation of the conditioned response, even with a really long pause. Now, learners tend to generalize to some kinds of stimuli that aren't the conditioned stimulus and discriminate between others. So let's use an example. I like this one. We've got the unconditioned stimulus of a passionate kiss eliciting the unconditioned response of sexual arousal. Okay, sounding good so far. Now we have a neutral stimulus of your romantic partner always has onion breath. So every time you first see your romantic partner, when they show up, you're like, onion breath again. But then you passionately kiss and arousal occurs. So every time you guys see each other, onion breath precedes passionate kissing, which leads to sexual arousal, so that pretty soon onion breath elicits sexual arousal. I like this demonstration. It was in an older version of the textbook, and I liked it because, it's just, we all go, onion breath? I don't think so. But you were buying it when I said shampoo, or if we substitute onion breath for cologne, or we substitute onion breath for minty fresh breath or something like that, you'd buy it more readily. But the truth is, whatever the conditioned stimulus is, whatever that neutral stimulus is that precedes the unconditioned stimulus, will become a conditioned stimulus. If you've ever wondered if you've never dated a smoker and you've wondered how could a person date a smoker and want to kiss them and stuff, their partners oftentimes who don't smoke will say, cigarette breath actually becomes kind of arousing after a while. And you're like, what? Because the pleasant smells, you can see it. The less pleasant smells, you're like, it doesn't make sense. But it does through classical conditioning. Okay, so let's assume my premise is accurate, that you could form a classically conditioned response to onion breath. Here's where generalization comes in. Maybe your partner shows up one day without onion breath, but instead has garlic breath. And you respond to that garlic breath exactly the way that you had to the onion breath. That's called generalization. It's similar enough to the onion breath that you've been conditioned to that it elicits the same responses. Discrimination. Let's say one day your partner shows up with minty fresh breath. Now it's something that you would assume that you would like, right? But it's not what you're classically conditioned to. So you may not get that conditioned response to minty fresh breath that you would to onion breath, or even to garlic breath that you've generalized to. So we can discriminate between the conditioned stimulus and things that are different enough from it that our brain goes, yeah, I don't think that's the same stimulus. They discovered this with Pavlov's dogs, that if they were conditioned to a bell that had a particular frequency, right, so it had a certain pitch, dogs would generalize to similar bell tones as long as it was a bell. It didn't have to be perfect. It could be a different pitch. It could be a slightly different frequency. It could be a different size bell. As long as it sounded like a bell, they mostly would respond to it. They would generalize to it. But you couldn't get a dog who'd been trained to bells to generalize to a buzzer. That didn't work. They discriminated between buzzers and bells. Buzzers were not informative. So you can tell that the learner is looking for things that are, I realize nature is not perfect, and so maybe it doesn't exactly smell the same, or it doesn't exactly sound the same, but it's close enough. And so I'll respond that way. If it's different enough, yeah, I don't think this is just naturally occurring variations. I think this is not the same conditioned stimulus. All right, now there are some criticisms of Pavlov's theory, and this is not a theory that's designed to explain all kinds of learning. This is a theory that's designed to explain a lot of gut reaction kinds of responses that us humans might have. Not feeling comfortable in a particular place. It might be because it's eliciting some kind of conditioned response in you, and you don't even know what it is. So it's a lot of those kinds of sort of subconscious or unconscious responses that we might have. He did not take into consideration cognitive processes. Here we have a cartoon that says inventions we could really use, and it's a can opener with a mute button so that the dog and the cat don't come running over to see if it's dinner time because they hear a can being opened. Any of you who feed your animals canned food that has to be opened with a can opener, you open a can of corn and they come running over, especially if it's anywhere near dinner time. Now, the fact that they can get up and come running over to see if this might be food kind of implies that they're thinking more elaborate thoughts than just having gut reactions, right? They've made associations that are allowing them to make decisions about how to act and where to go and things like that. He also underestimated the importance of biological constraints. It's easy to train a dog to drool because dogs drool pretty heavily. I love this picture. The picture is taken by the owner who's sitting in the driver's seat of this car eating a hamburger while the dog is just, oh, come on, man, give me a bite. Dogs can really easily train to drool or to eye blink with a puff of air or things like that. Humans, we can probably be classically conditioned to do even more elaborate things because we aren't as constrained by our biology. So we can make pretty elaborate behaviors in a classically conditioned response. So a lot of the basic research on classical conditioning was done on animals. And so we got a picture that was kind of limited of what we could classically condition. And then when researchers started looking at humans, we now realize we can classically condition phobias in small children, probably mostly prelingual children. We can classically conditioned addiction. We can, some of our behaviors are very much classically conditioned, and they're very elaborate behaviors. We're not as constrained by our biology. Now, I want to throw something in about classical conditioning, because I actually got to meet John Garcia when I was in graduate school, and he was really, he told us a really interesting story about how difficult it was for him to publish his findings. Back in the 1950s, he started testing associations between something neutral, or in my case, I would call it cotton candy positive, and then something that actually is nauseating, and then actually getting sick, right? He was interested in how it can be that the neutral and unconditioned stimulus happen up to 48 hours before the unconditioned response, and we still will file back in our memories and develop a taste aversion to the neutral stimulus food that we consumed, so that, when we next time see the cotton candy, it makes us sick. It makes us go, oh God, I don't eat cotton candy. I got really sick after I ate cotton candy one time. I like this example of cotton candy because naturally it doesn't really make you sick. I mean, I guess you could eat so much sugar that you feel nauseated, but in my example, what made the person sick is that they went on the spinny ride, right? But a lot of times we file back through what we've eaten to figure out if we might have gotten food poisoned. We now call this the Garcia Effect. The idea that you could experience a taste, get sick up to 48 hours later, and figure out that the thing that you tasted might be the reason why you're sick, and you develop a taste aversion to it. If you've ever had food poisoning, or if you've ever eaten something right before the onset of the flu or the norovirus or whatever, so that you're throwing up, you'll blame whatever the last thing it was that you ate, or the one thing that you ate that nobody else ate, even if it's because you had the norovirus. You're sick because of something objective. We'll still blame it on the last thing we ate because of the Garcia effect. And what he suggested is that this is really an adaptive response, right? The idea that we don't go back and eat again food that might have made us sick, right? So he had a lot of trouble publishing this, though, because back in the 1950s, the research on classical conditioning had been saying that you have got to present that, all of the neutral stimulus, unconditioned stimulus, and the responding all has to happen really, really close together, or the learner will never put it together. But it could be up to 48 hours. And you might think, well, you just got done talking about we don't have the biological constraints. Us humans, 48 hours. But I'm sure other animals, maybe it has to be closer. Come to find out, even birds can look back to, what is making me sick? I did eat that monarch butterfly. I'm never eating another monarch butterfly. Monarch butterflies actually contain toxins from the milkweed plant, and they make birds throw up. And birds will eat one monarch butterfly and never touch another one. They won't touch an emperor butterfly. They generalize to other butterflies that look similar to monarchs, and they will never eat another one again. It's pretty powerful. So luckily, ultimately, Garcia got it published, and now it's so obvious, right, that you would make this kind of an association. But boy, in the 50s, they gave him a really hard time about how, he's drawing incorrect conclusions and things like that. All right, let's take a break here, and we will come back and switch to another kind of learning, operant conditioning.